America, my name is Osei-Frimpong, and tonight I'm going to give you a general theory of vigilante violence because I think we need it in these times where we're going to try to figure out what makes sense about Luigi Mangione's efforts to exact justice on the body of Brian Thompson. I'm going to do a different video either tomorrow or later on in the week on Brian Thompson as a villain, and he needs to be depicted as a villain. And I'm going to go through Brian Thompson's career because right now the media is depicting Brian Thompson as someone who's not a villain, as just a nice father of two kids, and not, the guy who made his nut by denying people health care as a life, and he made $10 million a year. And not only that, he also is being investigated for defrauding stake shareholders of United Health because he dumped a bunch of stocks when they were being investigated. He was pushing AI to do automatic denials for claims, and this AI program had like allegedly had like a 90% error rate, and he was just a bad guy. He was a horrible human being, and we need to think of him as the American Eichmann. That's going to be a different video. But I just want to get ahead of the people who want to just think of him as a nice father. Like the guy was Tony Soprano of the Accountant set. And we need to think of him as that. And as that. A whole problem in America. But first, we're going to talk about a general theory of vigilante violence. And in terms of a general theory of vigilante violence, we have to understand that the state cannot have a monopoly of power, violence. The state cannot have a monopoly of violence in a free nation with other institutional forms. So if the United States only cared about state freedom and didn't care about liberty in all of its forms. For example, the idea that you can organize your family the way you want to, or that you can marry whoever you want to, or that you are a property owner and have the right to discharge your property as you would like. And that content means actually enforcing boundaries on things you don't like, both on your property, both like on your family, and even in civil society. Civil society is the market-based organization where we produce goods and services for each other. So if the goods and services in civil society are not produced according to how they were supposed to be produced for you, then you need to have a right, an extrajudicial right, to enforce your civil claim. All of these institutions of self-determination pre-exist the state. You can have property without a state. You can have families without a state. You can have particular properties without a state, and particular kinds of families without a state. And you can have particular kind of civil interactions without a state. And you particularize yourself through enforcing boundaries and enforcing both internal and external policing. And now this all becomes more robust and efficient and clear with state governance. And you can do things with state governance that you can't do outside of a state and solve certain kinds of problems. But at every level that there are institutions of freedom, there's an institutions of internal policing that has to be legitimate, unless it's going to be, an unfree authoritarian state where families and property and everything is dictated by the government, right? So if you're going to have differentiated institutions of freedom, even institutions of freedom that can check governmental power legitimately, then you're going to have to cede violence, C-E-D-E, cede violence and the ability for violence into all of these different kinds of institutional forms. And we even enshrine this in the Second Amendment of the Constitution, where we said that, like, in order to check government, like, we need to give people a gun. If all violence were to come from government, then that wouldn't even be intelligible. So there is a space for stand your ground laws. There is a space for even bodily autonomy arguments against the state forcing you to not do what you want to with your body. Now, these are going to be relatively weak arguments relative to the power of the state, which has to be overwhelming. But there has to be room for non-state, non-political freedom, non-political violence, right? So insofar as the health care industry is a civil participant, a private industry and a civil participant, then and they weren't like encroaching on Mangione's rights as a civil participant, then he has a space to exert some sort of vigilante justice on them, and then the state can deal with him as a vigilante. But there is a space. There is a space. Now, there's also the argument that the real target of this violence probably should be the media, right? So the target of the violence is actually is appropriate, and I'm gonna once again, I think Brian Thompson is a wonderful villain for this story. And I'm not saying he deserved to do it, but I'm what you call a villain blamer. But what was he wearing? Maybe he deserved it. No, but like you look at his record and there are lots of ways to live a life where you don't have people trying to kill you. He did not live such a life. And there are and if people do try to kill you, then it isn't a complicated question about whether you deserved it. There are lots of ways to live a life where that's well, that's not the case. But Brian Thompson did not live that life, right? So anytime you have institutions if you're going to have pre-political institutions of freedom, you're going to have pre-political institutions of violence. And since that violence isn't necessarily state violence, it can be interpreted as vigilante violence. And we need to admit that vigilante violence is always going to be with us. Like I said, it's even enshrined in the Constitution. And how we deal with vigilante violence is something that the court is now poised to deal with. But vigilante violence there's a way in which there needs to be a carve out. And that doesn't mean it doesn't get punished. It means that it's not the end of the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation about whether the violence was legitimate or not. I mean, yeah. So we're going to see this played out in the trial for the next year. And yeah, I just think that, the media. The media is the real target of the problem, because if the media is doing the job, you don't need Luigi Mangione doing the job. Like he's, if the media does its job, then we don't have to do end around the media, because one of the aspects of a democratic culture that we're still trying to figure out, because we're a relatively young nation and democracy is relatively young. One of the aspects of a democratic culture is that it needs the responsible use of vigilante violence that it must actually disperse among the people, right? So I said before that if you're going to have non-political or non-state institutions of freedom, then you need to have non-state institutions of violence, under state violence, but also like autonomous violence. And you need a people who can then wield autonomous violence responsibly. And that needs to be a cultural condition of a democracy that actually is going to realize all of these different institutions of freedom. Right? But the only way you get that responsible use of vigilante violence is with a media that actually gives air to all of the people's criticisms, so they don't have to like go to this other way to get the discourse. Right? The idea that Brian Thompson's public assassination might be good for the nation because it gets us talking about this issue means that we don't have a media that allows us to talk about this issue in the way that we should. If we had a media that actually allowed the frustrations to both bubble up and be made articulate, then we wouldn't need an assassination of a CEO as a rallying cry, as a steam release to actually get the policies we need for the nation to be who we are, to be a better version of who we are, right? So the fact that our media is captured and our political imagination is captured in a way that doesn't actually articulate the frustrations of the people means that the frustrations have to be articulated in a different way. And this is the different way in which our frustrations are articulated. And that, I think, is a problem. That is a problem. So if the media were doing its job, then we would have this conversation without the need for a public assassination. But the fact that we are having this conversation because of a public assassination suggests that the public assassination was like an appropriate tactic, which is unfortunate. Right? So once again, the general theory in defense of U.S. vigilantism is that anytime you have non-state institutions of freedom, this includes family, property ownership, civil society, religion, then you need non-state exercises and rights around the violence that those non-state institutions of freedom are allowed to use to express or to realize themselves as institutions of self-determination that are not determined by the state. And, even according to the Second Amendment, you need these institutions to have autonomous power against the state. Against the state. So it's not that the state doesn't have access to overwhelming violence. It's just that the state doesn't have a singular monopoly of violence, of legitimate violence. So when these other institutional concerns use that violence, then that can't be the end of the conversation. That should be the beginning of the conversation. Well, okay, they used their violence. Was this an appropriate use of vigilante violence or an inappropriate use of vigilante violence? By what right, and how do we think about it? But the idea that all vigilante violence is bad just because it's violence is ridiculous, is absurd. If you want a state that allows for autonomous institutions of freedom, autonomous formations of freedom, for free families that aren't dictated by the state, but are going to be distinct from other, are going to conduct themselves in a way that's distinct from other people, and keep out their influences that would lead to pollution, right? So it's same with property ownership. If you're going to be serious about property ownership, then you need to be serious about people having the right to defend their property and discharge their property as they see fit. So stand your ground laws can make sense, right? Now, if you're just willy-nilly shooting people, then, you start off saying there's appropriate use of U.S. violence because I was standing my ground, defending my property. And then it goes to the court, and then they realize that you are actually not defending your property as much as you were willy-nilly shooting people, right? So in a nation where there are many different forms of freedom, you're going to have many different forms of violence. And those forms of violence can be adjudicated in the court. But you can't deny people their right to use violence in order to secure their institution of non-political freedom against people who would encroach or invade that non-political freedom, right? So the idea that the state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence doesn't really take non-state freedoms seriously. They think all freedoms are forms of state freedom. And, for example, there are, ways of freely organizing your family that you have an immediate kind of unity with that pre-exist the state. There are ways of organizing even market societies that pre-exist the state. There are ways of property ownership that pre-exist the state. And if we're going to be serious about upholding all of those forms, there are ways of consciousness and religious identity that pre-exist the state. So if we're serious about upholding freedom and all of its vices, not just the ones that only come through the state, then we need to delegate autonomy to those other institutional forms of freedom so that they can police themselves. Police themselves as they see fit, and not have to have that be like to use permission from the state in order to police themselves as they see fit. And defend themselves as they see fit. So there are lots of different ways you can be a self, and all of these selves are like allow for a quality of defense and a quality of violence. And just the idea that all violence is bad unless it comes from the state is not really serious about these non-political freedoms and the conditions of these non-political freedoms. Right? So part of the state culture needs to be teaching people how to responsibly wield their vigilante violence, not denying the existence and the necessity and the legitimacy of vigilante violence, but teaching people how to wield their vigilante violence responsibly. And people get caught up in the idea of vigilante violence as like there's no such thing as responsible wielding of vigilante violence, but actually there is. There actually is. Which is why we think it's okay. Which is why we think it's okay for like people to defend themselves. If we didn't think it was okay for people to defend themselves with violence, then we would have everyone call the police no matter if they're being attacked, like at the moment, because we don't think violence is appropriate. Like, and then if we talk about violence in terms of self-defense, we got to understand like what is the self, what counts as protecting the self. Yourself as a family member, yourself as a property owner, yourself as a civilian in civil society, like shooting yourself even as a political actor needs to be defended, and not necessarily by the state. Right? So if when in a more robust understanding of self, we understand like kind of more robust need for vigilante violence. And that needs to be mediated by like, you know, the overwhelming violence of the state, but it has to partial out in little bits of violence in defense of all of your institutions of freedom, or they stop being institutions of freedom. Right? Do I worry about right-wing violence towards the left? I mean, yeah, we live in a clan country, so yeah, I guess, but I understand that this is part of the American story. Figuring this out is part of the American story, so that's what I worry. By the way, if you appreciate me talking like this and spending my time doing this, go ahead and go to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month. There aren't going to be people who actually tell you that the state does not have the monopoly of legitimate violence. There aren't going to be people who make the argument about if you're going to have families, if you're going to have free families, those free families need to be able to defend themselves as free families. If you're going to have free civilians who secure their livelihood from the market, those civilians are going to have to be able to defend themselves as civilians. And, you know, it might not be through the state, right? Even if you're going to have free citizens, this is what the Second Amendment is about. If you're going to have free citizens, you're going to have to defend yourself even from the state. If you're going to have free property owners need to have the discretion to defend their property and not rely on the state to do it, because maybe the state won't defend their property in the way that the property owner wants their property defended. And since the property owner is the owner of the property, they should be able to pick how they want their property defended. In the same way they should, like, as far as the family member is realizing themselves as free through the family, they should be able to pick how they want the family defended. Same with civilian life and the same with political life. So just the idea that all violence can't be marshaled through the state in the same way that all freedom can't be run through the state is just something we need to grip with, which means that if we're going to have a free society, we need to teach all Americans to respect vigilante violence and to wield vigilante violence respectfully, and to understand that vigilante violence isn't necessarily wrong. It's the start of the conversation about was this instance of vigilante violence wrong? Right? So thank you for your case. Thank you for your time. If you appreciate what I'm doing, go to www.funkyacademic.com. Share this on all your socials. I'll come back either tomorrow if I have time or the day after on the video on Brian Thompson, because I think it's very important that this man is not just understood as like a plucky guy from Iowa who made good, but a whole villain who made millions and millions of dollars, $10 million a year, like figuring out new and inventive ways to deny you health care. And what that means, that we support that as a system, and that it is not okay, and that you don't want your sons doing this. You don't want your sons wanting to be Brian Thompson, and that's a problem. You don't want your daughters trying to, I think that's a big thing. You don't want your daughters to try to be Brian Thompson either. So just because you made the money doesn't mean you're a success. The guy's a pariah. And it's possible the best thing he does in his life is die spectacularly. It's not my business to kill them. It's also not my business to stand in the way of Mangione, who killed him, and now raised the quality of discourse in the nation about both vigilante violence and healthcare. Thank you for your time. I will talk to you later. Peace.